The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Musings on the WordPress REST API, Moving Past the Hype and into Practical Usage. Your speakers for today are Andrew Taylor, Agency and Community Engineer here at Pantheon, along with our guest speaker, Daniel Bachhuber, Principal and Founder at Handbuilt. Just a few housekeeping items to go over before we start. Please make sure you submit any questions you have during the presentation in the question window or tweet them at GetPantheon. We will answer as many of the questions as we can during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Also, this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available to everyone later this week. I'd now like to turn it over to Daniel and Andrew.
Hey, thanks so much for having me here today. Looking forward to talking to everyone about the REST API. Like mentioned, I'm the principal at Handbuilt. It's a consultancy of me, myself, and I. I'm also the maintainer of WP CLI, WordPress's command line interface, and I was one of the contributing developers to the WordPress REST API. I'm Daniel Bachhuber on GitHub and TinyLetter, and in my free time, I have a family that I love in Oregon, and my current project, which I don't know how I got the outdated slides, but my current project's really awesome. It's building a shed quarters in my backyard, and it's going to be so cool. So I'll post those to my blog when it's up.
So I'm Andrew. As said, I'm an agency and community engineer at Pantheon. So I split my time working with our agency partners on WordPress projects and consulting. And then the community portion is speaking at conferences, webinars like this, and contributing back to code. So when I'm away from the computer, I like to stay active and then enjoy some good local craft beer wherever I travel and catch a soccer match when I'm back at home.
So we thought we'd start today's presentation by taking you through some real-world examples of the WordPress REST API. First up is WAMU.org, which launched in December as a partnership between 10up and WAMU. And like you can see, it's a website for a local news radio station. The compelling use of the REST API in this project was to enable a persistent audio player down here at the bottom of the screen. So the website itself is in React. You'll see, kind of that initial page load. I'm not sure actually if that caught in the webinar. And you can go ahead and hit, play on the audio player. You'll begin playing, and that allows you to navigate through the site, listening to the audio broadcast without refreshing the audio player, but using the website, as you'd want to use a website in an application-like experience. So this is, what's known as a single-page app experience. The second demo, which I thought was very, very cool, was a interactive project from Boston University's alumni magazine. The article is titled "Of Hoops and Healing," and this is a quarterly alumni magazine where they do several interactive features as a part of the publication. So the feature here is this "Enter the Court." It's an interactive storytelling experience where you can begin your journey. I'm going to continue without sound because it doesn't go through very well. It starts out prompting for you to write in some self-reflections. So special significance as place of origin, word that encompasses who I am, WordPress, hey. So when I hit throw, it's submitting a custom comment type to the WordPress REST API and storing that in the database as a form of user-generated content. So enter a trauma or oppression you've experienced. Last September, I fell on my bike. Something that has held you back. Dropping out of school. Intense. So each time I'm interacting with this story, it's storing a custom comment in the database, and I'll show you how that gets used at the end. Where you or those around you have been suppressed. Wow, that's tough. I actually don't know that I've been suppressed in many ways, but lack of opportunity, say. And you go through the experience. There's some audio that's playing here that you can't really hear. Scroll up. Long. There we go. We made it. So I'm just going to cut to the chase. At the end, there's a word cloud of all the user-generated comments. I'm not going to take you guys through the rest of the experience. So when they were building this, they considered gravity forms, but it was too rigid for what they wanted to do. The REST API turned out to be the perfect tool. It was built by a two-person team. There was one developer working on the REST API aspect and the WordPress backend, and then another developer that was working on the front-end experience. The REST
That's pretty
API
cool.
enabled a two-person development workflow. Yeah, I think I actually just reached out yesterday for some examples, and someone, yeah, actually the developer on this team, weighed in with his, and I was like, wow, this is like the coolest thing I've seen so far. So.
Yeah, it's really awesome that a team of two people was able to build something like that. And with a quarterly newsletter, they're probably able to build really awesome things like that in every publication, which is nice.
Mm-hmm. Which brings up a great question. Should you use the WordPress REST API in your project? To provide a bit of history, the infrastructure was committed to WordPress 4.4. That's the WP REST server class, which handles the serving and dispatching of requests. And then in WordPress 4.7, the content endpoints came in for basic read-write operations on posts, users, terms, comments, and then a few read-only endpoints made their way into. So, we produce this short list of opportunities in using the WordPress REST API. One, obviously, the single-page app experience provides a much more native, intuitive, elegant, better user experience if your use case merits it. I think that, for a publishing website, I'd be looking at the number of average number of page views per user. If you're in the 1 range, then you're really only building a single page app experience for a small percentage of users, those users that are actually navigating onto the rest of your site. But if you have a highly engaged user base that's reading 10, 15, 30 articles a month, then potentially it makes more sense. Separation of concerns is an opportunity for the Boston University development group. They could separate out development of the back end versus development of the front end. Architecturally and infrastructurally, it allows you to scale WordPress independently of the front end and implement different strategies for caching, that sort of thing. In using the WordPress REST API, WordPress can become a platform for other services. Editorial can enter the content in one place, and it becomes accessible everywhere through a industry standard JSON-based REST API. Similarly, using WordPress as a part of your data production stack provides a familiar backend for content creators and lets you pick your choice of tooling for the rest of the product. Lastly, as I mentioned before, the WordPress REST API really is a modern interface for interacting with WordPress. Modern in relative terms, obviously. Twitter has had a REST API for a long time now, as Facebook. Facebook's even kind of leading the charge with GraphQL. WordPress has had XMLRPC, which if you ever have had to deal with XMLRPC, it's pretty awful. So WordPress is playing a little bit of catch up in this regard, but it's an opportunity in itself.
Those sound like some awesome benefits. Are there any downsides to using the REST API?
Hey, great question. As you can see, by the way that I've laid out these points, it's still very much early days. So I think the REST API, can excel in, kind of a subset of use cases. If you're used to using kind of all of WordPress, every feature of WordPress, there's some ways certainly that it's still kind of lacking. So we'll run through those. One, it's missing some features of the WordPress admin. couple notable things. Post previews, not something that happens natively through the REST API. Various implementations in the real world have implemented their own solution to that, but there's no kind of standard works out of the box way to do post previews. Menu management too. The menu management endpoints haven't been written or committed to core, and conceptually there's still a bunch of work to do around how menu management is expressed in the REST API. Your URL routing is a pain between PHP and JavaScript. So if you're going after the single page app experience, you'll typically want to have the same routes defined in your JavaScript application as you have in your WordPress application, so that WordPress, as it's loading, can do some of the kind of heavy lifting for the initial payload of the page. And just keeping those in sync can be painful. It'd be really awesome if someone invented a way to keep those in sync automatically. Authentication, still a pain point. So cookie-based authentication is included in WordPress core. That'll work if if you're if you have an application where users are writing data and need to have WordPress user accounts and login and that sort of thing, that'll cookie-based authentication will work if they're on the same domain. But for anything app experience, that sort of thing, there's no official recommendation yet for OAuth 1 and OAuth 2, although there are some plugins that you can use. And then, as I mentioned before, we're very much in the early days of how WordPress's own internal architecture needs to evolve in order to translate itself into HTTP and REST. For instance, widgets. The widget API is essentially, supply a callback to render a form and supply a callback to render the front-end markup for that form. Because there isn't a ton of structure around that, trying to translate that to JSON and REST, we're having to just do a lot of inventing and coming up in blue ocean thinking and coming up with new solutions. So if widgets are a key part of the site that you want to build, and the customizer experience and that sort of thing, you're just going to need to accommodate for that in some way as a part of your project plan. So ultimately, the conclusion I personally come to is that decoupled apps are a far greater amount of effort than building a WordPress theme. If you know how to build WordPress themes and you think, what, I can do this project in a WordPress theme, you should maybe do it in a WordPress theme. But if there is some compelling business case for building a decoupled app, the REST API certainly enables that now.
So if I'm a developer and my client comes in and they want a single page application, more just because they think it's cool and modern and there's not really a business case, it sounds like I sort of have a lot of things to think about, that they're used to using WordPress for a lot of the great features, so things like going in and adding a new page to their navigation menu is not something they're going to be able to do with the decoupled app. So they'll probably email you, and that's more hours, and you just
well, and it becomes a maintenance burden too, right? Because if you build this, more technically advanced implementation, then 2 years down the road, when you've decided to pivot and do something else, they're going to have to find someone that has that level of skill in order to maintain the thing that you've built for them. I think that it's important to note that there's a spectrum between WordPress theme and fully decoupled app, and that you can get a lot of the benefit by just using, a partially progressively enhanced experience. This, interactive story is just embedded in an article, and it's a very, compelling, amazing experience that didn't require the entire development team to rebuild the entire site as a decoupled app. So there's probably opportunities to create kind of intermediate implementations of the REST API, and hopefully these opportunities and challenges that we've identified presents you a framework for helping to assess clients' needs.
very cool. So if a client comes in and they want some sort of experience or something for I don't know, maybe like an event coming up or something, then think about rolling that into a page template and not redoing the entire site. Makes a lot more sense.
Exactly. Over to you,
Cool.
Andrew.
Yeah, gonna go ahead and talk about routes and endpoints now. So we're gonna start digging into what actually using the REST API as a developer looks like. So first thing I want to do is cover some REST API terms. These are things that are going to be useful as you're working with the REST API and as we kind of go through the rest of the presentation. So if you're not quite sure what a REST API is, it defines a set of functions that developers can perform requests and receive responses against across the web. So for example, if I make a call to the REST API, I can get the latest 10 posts from a blog. That's an example of a request and a response, and that response will come in JSON format. A route is the name in the URL that you use to access an endpoint. And so you might be going, well, what is an endpoint? Endpoints are the functions that are available through the API. And one thing to note here is that you can have multiple endpoints per route. So we'll take a look at an example of that here in a second. And then we also have HTTP methods. These are important. The main ones you'll use with the REST API are get, post, put, and delete. And each one kind of maps to a different action. So for example, get should be used when you want to get something from the API. Post should be used when you want to post some data and create something new. Put is for updating existing resources, and then delete is for, of course, deleting things. And that's also useful to know what HTTP status codes are. So these are going to be returned with the response from the REST API. And so if you pass an invalid post ID or an argument is passed wrong, you might get a status code of 400 bad requests back. And if you look up what those status codes are, you'll be able to have some more information to help you kind of diagnose and troubleshoot what's going on.
I was always confused by status codes when I, kind of first started developing, because it's like, well, can't I just include the status in the body of the response? What are some of the other status codes and why are they useful?
Sure. Like it will return a 404 if a route's not found. So if you're trying to make a request to an endpoint that doesn't exist, for instance, you'll get a 404. So you can just search around and look at all the status codes. 200 is kind of the general everything's okay, and you're getting a valid response. And then 400, like I said, is when you're doing something wrong in your request and the server doesn't quite know how to handle what you're asking of it. And so here's an example we can kind of break down of a REST API request. So you have your regular domain and then /WP JSON. That's called the index. And that's going to be in every request you make to the REST API. And this is just where the routing for the REST API kind of takes over. And WordPress knows that you want to make a request to the REST API rather than viewing a normal page or post or some other piece of content. In the middle there, we have WPv2. This is the namespace. So this is what you want to use to identify your application or maybe your plugin you're creating or whatever else you're using with the REST API. WordPress core uses WPv2. That's because the API is in version 2 and then WP for WordPress. And then post at the end is a route. So that's the actual sort of route that we're going to hit within the WPv2 namespace. And notice that we don't actually choose an endpoint there. Remember, endpoints kind of map to different functions, and those are done with the HTTP request. So if we made a GET request to this route, then that would tell the REST API that we want to get those lists of posts. But if we make a post request and we pass along sort of post title and content and those sorts of things to the API, then it knows that it needs to create a new post. So you can have multiple endpoints per route, and that's important to remember.
I think that's also kind of a key point of REST APIs too. REST APIs are really about resources, where a resource is a type of a thing. A post is a resource, a page is a resource. Each resource has its own data model, different attributes and data defined on that. And then REST itself, the principle of REST, is very much about performing HTTP operations against those resources. So a GET request gets the resource, a put request update the resource, a delete request deletes it. The essence of REST is HTTP operations on resources.
Yeah, and that's pretty unique to the web, and kind of cool that we're able to take advantage of that. One more thing I want to note here is that the REST API is stateless. So that means that each request and response are independent of each other. So if you're trying to create a new post and you forget to send the post title with your request, then the response is going to come back with that error and tell you that the title argument is required, etc. And then you can't just send back title. You have to send a whole new request with all the information you previously sent, as well as the title that you forgot. So the REST API won't remember any of the previous requests, so treat each one like a new one. And as we mentioned, WordPress 4.7 has default routes included. Daniel kind of talked about posts, comments, we have terms, users, and all of those have read and write access. And I just wanted to mention metadata and settings are available as well, but they are opt-in only. If you've ever looked at your WP options table, there's probably quite a bit in there, and the REST API doesn't want to expose all of that because a lot of it's private and things like that, and might not be something that you even want to use or need to use on the front end of your site. So you might not want Yoast SEO keywords when you're just rendering a blog post on the front end, because that's more of sort of admin content. So those are opt-in. So we're going to look at some examples of how to opt into those here in a minute. And as we said before, everything is under WP JSON, but then we have WP V2 posts. Here is an example. If you just go to /WP JSON on a site with the REST API enabled, you'll actually be able to do some discovery and see what endpoints are there. So this is showing the response from /WP JSON, and it gives me that information on the post endpoint, and I can see all of the methods I can pass there. And we can see that for the get method, it'll tell you like what's required and things like that. So ID is not required for get because we're just getting a list of posts and they already have IDs. But if I were to use post and create something new, then I'd probably have to pass in title and content, some of those things that would be required. So we can see what this looks like. This is just screenshots I pulled from WP Tavern. If you want to go look at the WordPress REST API out in the wild, you can just go to wptavern.com/wp-json and take a look there. And we can see here that the data for this post, I'm pulling it by the post ID, is being served in that JSON format. So this is kind of neat. If we talked about doing single page applications or something within like a specific area of your site, this kind of opens the door to a lot of things as more and more sites have the REST API out in the wild. For example, I read news from WP Tavern and a few other sources. I could create my own single page app that would just pull in articles from all of those news sources, so I don't have to bounce around the web and get them. And it would be a lot cleaner than trying to parse RSS feeds or scrape HTML or something else.
Another cool thing about REST versus RSS is that RSS, you only get the posts in reverse chronological order, that sort of thing. With the REST API distributed across the web, you can actually query the data based off of different arguments. So if you wanted to get all posts published across the web within a certain date range, that's something that the REST API supports by default.
Yeah, or maybe I only care about certain categories or tags or things as well. So opting in to the REST API for a custom post type is really easy. We have this show in REST argument that we can just pass in as true, and then WordPress will add a route for your custom post type. I'm using books as an example here of my custom post type, and that will actually come back in and create a books endpoint for me. And that includes...
Well, so what about that show, or oh, I forgot my question. What comes with show and REST? Why should I use that over just registering my own endpoint?
Yeah, so it's really nice because you're kind of extending the endpoints that are already there in the existing infrastructure. So permission checks come in, validation, and then you can also extend further with metadata and things. So if you think about, we're creating this custom post type and an endpoint for it, WordPress will handle the permission and things so that if someone tries to create a new book and they're not authenticated, then that will fail. So that's a good example of something that it takes care of for you. And let's say we have some data, metadata with our books that we want to display in our endpoint. We can use register REST field, and the first item I'm passing there, books, is the post type. So this can be any post type. It can also be a taxonomy term. So if you're creating an endpoint for custom taxonomies, you can add metadata there as well. And then rating is just the label that's going to be displayed in the output from the REST API. So my metadata stored in the database is _book_rating, and that's kind of an ugly label, so we're just going to call it rating on the front end. And then we have a get callback, so when someone does the get operation, then we're just going to use get post meta to go find that rating. And then update, we're going to accept a value between 0 and 5, and if it's between that, then we're using update post meta to go ahead and add a new rating. So that kind of goes back with the REST API. When you show in REST true, taking care of the routes, is then when we go in and register our meta, we can have callbacks for the different operations there as well. And so now that response will look something like this. It'll give me an array of objects for each book, and with that I have like ID, I have date, I have slug, and then down at the bottom there we can see our rating. And so one thing we might want to do is, if we go back and take a look here, we have like date and date GMT. Maybe I don't care about the GMT time, is we can use the filter REST prepare. And then again, this is REST prepare books, but that can also be a different custom post type or a taxonomy as well if you're working with something different. And then I can go in and just unset the items that I don't want displayed, which is kind of nice because it's data that I'm not going to use, so we can remove it and save some bytes on our request and our response. And so we come back in and those are gone. So I just have the standard date and not the GMT when I go back and look at those books. And I do just want to say, be careful when you do this. It's okay to do it, in this case for a custom post type, but WordPress core, plugins, and other things rely on some of this data for the custom endpoints. So I would caution you, for example, to remove the GMT date from the default posts endpoint, because even though your application might not be relying on it, there's a good chance that something else is, and you don't want to remove some functionality and hinder something else.
If I might add a little bit more to that too, I think that for those that want to get involved in core development, one kind of interesting opportunity right now is that there's a lot of effort being put into figuring out how the REST API translates to the WordPress admin. When you register a custom post type, by default, it will give you some UI, default UI in the admin so that you can create a new book, edit an existing book, change the title, that sort of thing. Well, in the future, that could all be powered by the REST API. But if you're adding and removing fields from your REST API endpoints, tailor the data as it makes sense for your application, WordPress is going to have to know how to translate that declaration of your data model into some UI, backend UI that's been automatically generated. So the schema attribute with register REST field, you'll notice there that it allows you to define the type and then a description, and then there's actually even some more descriptive attributes that you can use to describe the shape of your data. But much of this is very much early days, and the end goal is to kind of create this architecture that's very cool and declarative and does a lot of what you want it to do for free. And there's a lot of problems to solve and implementation details to work out along the way.
Cool, thanks, Daniel. I did want to show an example. We talked earlier about how the entire site doesn't need to be an application, and so this was K-Adam of Boku, presented at LoopConf last month. And so if we come in and take a look, this is actually open source on GitHub. So he has this WP notebook example that is pretty cool, and it's using the REST API. So it looks like this. You come in and you have a list of all of the different journal entries, but you can also add a new one as well. So if I deselect some, then I can come in and click and go ahead and add a title and content, and this is actually using the WordPress REST API, and we can see here that it's sort of this really nice user experience, entering content from the front end and going back and being able to view that, so seeing a log of all my entries as well. And this is just a page template within WordPress using React and then using some of these items that we've talked about in the REST API. So if you just do a search for WP Notebook, you should be able to find that, and that's a really cool example to check out. One other thing I wanted to point out is K-Adam also released a WordPress REST API client library for JavaScript. So if you are interested in using React or Angular or something else JavaScript-based to interact with the WordPress REST API, this is definitely worth checking out. The client takes care of a lot of things for you, parsing data, pagination, a bunch of different things that you might struggle to do on your own if you're just getting started. So worth checking that out as well. So we sort of talked a bit about how you can opt into routes for custom post types and taxonomies and things, and modify those by adding and removing data as you see fit. But there are times when you just want to go with a completely custom route. So here we can have a custom route for our books, and we do this with register REST route, and we can see at the beginning there I have the namespace app v1, and then the route is books, and the method is get that I want to allow. You could also allow post and put, delete, and other items as well, and then the callback is going to be list books. So that's the name of the function that we'll take a look at in a minute that will actually list out the books. So pretty easy.
Why does register REST route require a namespace?
So that's a good question. Actually went with app v1 here, and this is so you don't collide with other items. You would want to replace app with the name of the app you're building, maybe your website or theme name or your plugin. And then v1, that way if you change your endpoints in the future and it's a breaking change, you can change that to say v2, and you can keep routes for both for some time. That way folks who are using v1, you won't launch and change routes and completely break everything depending on those routes. And then once you give people some time to transition, then you can change that namespace to v2. But yeah, it's mostly just separation of concerns, keeping your routes separate from anyone else who is registering items. They're each in their own namespace.
I think when you're thinking about namespaces too and versioning, you should be thinking in years, not months. Don't create a new version of your API with every plugin release or theme release, because that's just going to cause the world to fall upon you. Even though namespacing is a strategy for maintaining backwards compatibility and being able to release new versions of your API and do newer and interesting things, it's not a panacea, and you'll still have to have a strategy for maintaining support for the older versions of your API for as long as you need to.
Cool, and that's definitely true for things that you're releasing to the public. If you're doing a project for a client or something and you're building these routes and you're the only one who's going to consume them, then you might not need to be as cautious. So continuing with that, we're also going to register a route that is books and then the post ID of a book. And this will take the get method as well, so people can only read data from a book. Since we're only passing the get method here, the REST API will actually not allow anyone to do post or put or other operations, so folks can't create a new book through the API. And then our callback there is going to be called book details, and we're going to take one argument, ID, and that's going to be the post ID of the book that we want to grab the details for, and I'm checking if that's a valid ID with get post status.
So why not also check the type of the book? Are you introducing a security issue or some other problem right now?
Yeah, I actually think it is, because get post status will return true regardless of if this is a book or if it's something else like a standard post or a different post type. So potentially someone could view data of posts that I don't want them to view, like maybe e-commerce orders, for example.
So is this live in production somewhere?
This is not, thankfully. It's just an example. So that validate callback, you would actually want to do something more robust, and we put this in here as kind of a caution because it can be really easy to get something up and going with the REST API, but you kind of want to think through what you're doing and make sure that you're only returning the data that you actually want people to be able to get a hold of, whether that's intentionally or not. And we can actually use WP error here to give people making a request some information if something goes wrong. So in this case, if they pass in an ID and it's not a number, is numeric will return false, and then we can say invalid post ID format, please pass an integer, and ask them for a number. And there's that status code again of 400 saying that's a bad request. And then they should not attempt to make the same request again without some modifications.
I think I want a t-shirt that says HTTP status codes are really cool, because I think that they are really cool and underappreciated. So HTTP status codes give you a language for communicating with clients about the nature of their operation without having to reinvent that language each time. So way back in the day when I was doing admin Ajax stuff, I'd return status equals error and then create my own message. Message equals some human readable message. Or I'd have like error type equals, it's like, no, you don't have to do that, because you just look up the correct HTTP status code and return that, and you're golden.
Yeah, and they're pretty universal. So it's a language that a lot of developers are going to speak. So if you're returning a 400, a lot of people are, oh, I know, I must have passed a bad argument or something else.
It's like free
And
money.
And then we also are taking Daniel's suggestion here and checking um, the post type and making sure it's a book. And if it's not, then we'll return an error that that is an invalid book post ID. So along with that, I put something up in a GitHub gist of this sort of books example, and we can take a look at those callback methods there. So I'm just going to look at the book details endpoint. Remember, this is the one where someone's passing in an ID. So we're going in, we're taking that ID, we're getting the post meta for the rating, which I want. I want the thumbnail, so I'm grabbing that and some data associated with it, the URL, the width, the height. And then I am putting those into an array and returning them with WP REST response. So it'll actually take care of converting my array into some JSON for the response. And then something cool here is you can use response header if you want to modify headers. For example, I'm adding cache control. That way this endpoint can be cached for a week if I'm using a CDN or something else in front of this endpoint. So this is kind of nice. You can just see an example of how you can come in and create your own route, put exactly the information you want in there.
I think one idiosyncrasy worth noting is that WordPress's core content endpoints don't include cache control headers by default because WordPress itself has an imperfect API for determining, how long or whether some entity was modified or not. Like post modified seems like it'd be an indicator of the last time a post was modified, but we can't really reliably depend upon it to be. As you're creating your own cache control headers, make sure that you are setting them correctly and that stuff doesn't get cached indefinitely.
Yes, purging is one of the hardest things with caching. So, and then we can see what that response looks like. So we have a response for listing all of our books. So we can see there that we have the ID, the title, the rating, and then thumbnail is false because I didn't upload any thumbnail there. So you can also, if you don't have anything, return false or null or whatever you decide on for items without data. And then there's the example of just a single book. So that's the response from that callback function we were just looking at. And an example of this, this is a side project I did. My family was kind of emailing recipes back and forth, and Hazel was my great-grandmother. Unfortunately, she passed away some time ago, but had a bunch of recipe cards and things that I want to work on converting and adding them into the site. So it's a decoupled site running WordPress on the back end and React on the front end, and it's open sourced. It's on GitHub. My GitHub username is ataylorme if you want to go take a look at it, and we can just kind of see what that looks like. So, nice React user experience. If I want main dishes and I hit search, then it's going to load those in and pull those in. And one thing I kind of wanted to pull this example up for is that my custom endpoint takes arguments as well. So I can change, for example, post per page, what page number I'm on, and then I can pass things like recipe type is a taxonomy. So if you're creating some custom endpoints, you can get really creative with arguments and then pass those into a WP query or something and really kind of modify the data so you're getting back exactly what you want to look at.
So why'd you go with decoupled for this project?
So I went with completely decoupled, meaning that if we go back and look here, the REST API is at backend.hazelsheritage.com. So the WordPress install and the React install are actually on one. The backend is on a subdomain, and I did that for separation of concerns. I have a different Git repository for each one because the WordPress backend is mostly PHP, the React frontend is mostly JavaScript, and I wanted to host those on different places as well. So when I do a pull request or something else on the front end, I don't want any back-end code mixed in there, or vice versa. If I'm working on the front end or back end, those are kind of separate tasks, and I'm rarely working on both at the same time.
Did you write tests for your API endpoints?
I have not, but you know what? I need to. So why don't you tell me why I should have some tests, Daniel?
I will once I get presenter control back. Come on, presenter control. There we go. Just going to assume that it's working now. Yeah, so you need tests. And if you don't have tests right now, that's the next thing that you should add to Jira. And if you've written API endpoints in the past, you should go back and add tests to them. And if you don't know why you should have tests, you should read about the exploit that was fixed in WordPress 4.7.2 that was rated 9 out of 10. And even though it was really bad, tests probably wouldn't have caught it, because one of the challenging things about writing tests through REST API is you kind of really want to cover every possible permutation of data that can be thrown at the API. And you know, I haven't figured out a good way to programmatically do that. So if I haven't made my case already, I'm about to make my case right now. The first reason you need tests is for security, because you're building a REST API that essentially exposes your entire database to the whole internet. You should have test coverage to avoid disclosing private information to unauthorized requests, and also to ensure unauthorized requests can't perform unpermitted write operations to your application. So both of these issues were present in the bug fixed in WordPress 4.7.2. Not only could someone access a post that was, you know, private, unpublished, but they could also, any request, regardless of whether it was logged in or not, authorized or not, could perform a write operation on your application. Unfortunately, you know, it was really, really bad, and because WordPress has revisions by default, for most people, if there was, you know, posts that had been updated and compromised, it was a matter of going back in the revision history and reverting to the old version. There was no privilege escalation involved in WordPress 4.7.2 that required you to, you know, for instance, reset user passwords, that sort of thing. So tests let you, ensure that you're not disclosing private information to unauthorized requests, and also ensure unauthorized requests can't perform write operations. The second reason, but I mean, security, like, that's reason enough, right? It's like, you don't even need a second reason. But if you're looking for a second reason, reliability is also a good reason to include test coverage with your REST API endpoints. So you're building an API that other applications are going to build upon. Maybe they're internal applications that you have access to and can fix. Maybe they're vendor applications or even third-party applications that if you break your API, it's going to break a lot more systems that you don't necessarily have control over. So tests allow you to make assertions that your application returns expected response for every type of request, and that will give you confidence in stability and backwards compatibility when making changes to your API at a later date. So ultimately, in including tests as you write API endpoints, you're producing a much more solid foundation for other applications to build upon. So if you aren't convinced already, see me afterwards, because I'm going to make you convinced. So fortunately, adding tests to your WordPress-based project is quite easy using the WordPress PHPUnit test suite. So the WordPress project uses PHPUnit for unit and kind of integration tests across the project, and this can be leveraged in your own theme or plugin to write and run your own tests. So using WP CLI, you can run WP scaffold plugin tests or WP scaffold theme tests, and that will add some scaffolding files to your project. First, you'll get a Travis YAML, Circle YAML, or GitLab.yaml, depending on the continuous integration provider that you're using. Continuous integration is great because it'll run your test suite against every build, every change set that's pushed, without requiring your developers to run those locally. Although they should be if they're making changes. Bin install WP tests downloads a copy of the WordPress PHPUnit test suite. It creates a test database so that database interactions actually happen against a real database, and then it'll download a copy of WordPress to run the tests against. phpunit.xml.dist is simply a configuration file that points to tests/bootstrap.php, and that file does the bootstrapping process of loading the test suite, loading WordPress itself, and then finally running your tests. If you have an autoloader, you'll want to put that in the tests bootstrap file as well to make sure any libraries are loaded as well. So in using this WP CLI command, you get all of the kind of painful setup process done for you, so you can just focus on writing the tests. When you create your first test, this is just kind of an example. You may not may name your classes differently or put them in different places, but by default, PHPUnit is going to run tests located in the test directory prefixed with test dash, and then your classes. Classes I don't actually think have to follow a naming procedure, but your methods need to be prefixed with test in order to have PHPUnit run them by default. So the first kind of bit to setting up your REST API tests, first you've got a setup method, importantly call parent setup, because that's going to set up the rest of the WordPress test suite. If you erroneously forget to include that, then the sky will fall on your head unexpectedly at a later date. It's been known that the WordPress test suite breaks in unexpected ways when you don't call setup, because behind the scenes there's a lot of like globals resetting and that sort of thing happening. So really, underscore and make sure you have that so you don't be in pain later. Second bit of the process is to instantiate WP REST server. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this is the infrastructure that handles parsing the request and passing it to an endpoint and a route. And then doing the action REST API init will initialize your endpoints. So here you can see a sample test I've created. I'm mocking a new request object with a HTTP method get against this rad v1 site info route. I'm dispatching it through the server, so that's the server processing the request, passing it to the callback, returning the response, and then my assertions are twofold. I'm asserting expected HTTP status, and I'm also expecting that I get the data that I expected to get. So that's kind of the essence of writing a test against the API using the PHPUnit test suite.
So Daniel, if I was expecting a bunch of data there, is it better to write kind of one big test, or should I be breaking these out into smaller, more succinct tests?
Good question. I don't have a great answer. I like to, so this assert response data, I'm not sure if this actually exists in core. I don't think it made it in yet. So there's a link at the very end, some resources, and I wrote a blog post for Pantheon about writing tests. It's got all of these examples fleshed out in great detail. What I really like is having an assert response data type of assertion where you can assert two different arrays. Well, I guess in this case, assert response data is actually taking the response object, and then it calls response get data, which gets the data of the response, and it compares the two arrays without having to enforce an order of attributes. So in and as so far as writing tests goes, it makes it easier to write tests that test the entirety of the response data. So let's get comprehensive, because that's what it's all about. You need to make sure you test your endpoints thoroughly. Yeah. Okay, so you're writing tests and you're testing stuff thoroughly. And right now we don't really have like a factory for generating every possible permutation of how data can be passed to the API. That's kind of on you. As a rule of thumb, I like to test maybe one successful response scenario and then 3 or 4 or 5 type of failures. So you can see I'm using WP set current user. That's setting the user context for the request. In my previous example, there's no WP set current user, and so this request is in test get in this get method. It's being performed as like a logged out user, no authentication. And then WP set current user allows me to set the user context without actually having to run it through the authentication, cookie handling, that sort of thing. So in your test suite, if you're using WP set current user, you can assume that the authentication layer, provided you're using either WordPress's built-in authentication or one of the plugins that has test coverage as well, you can assume that the authentication aspect of it is covered. And so here it's mocking a post request, dispatching it through the server, asserting response status, asserting the response data, and I'm also asserting that the data actually was manipulated in the database as I expected it to be. So I think when you're making write operations, you definitely want to make sure that the data is being written to the database as you expect it to. You can't just trust that, the response for that, because that would be bad if the data was not being written into the database in the way that you wanted to. And so, there's just a few different ways I'm testing this particular type of request. Notably at the bottom, here's my 400 error status, and then the message is invalid parameter phone number. And then in this example, I have a validation callback that's actually validating the format. Validating the data present in the response. So when I include will this work as an empty string, it says, hey, that's not a phone number. Not going to accept this data.
Cool. Resources here, we'll be sending a follow-up email, so we'll send out these links, but just some items that we think are a good read. Daniel mentioned his blog post there, and then a couple other items, and I included some track tickets of using the REST API in parts of core for press this and quick draft. If you want to take a look at those or get involved there. And just wanted to make a plug for a day of rest. It's coming up actually next week on March the 9th in Boston. If you're looking to get started with the REST API or want to dive a little deeper, they have some awesome workshops and things as well. It's being sponsored by Post Status and the folks at Human Made, who are heavily involved in the REST API creation, and has a really awesome speaker lineup. So I'll be there and hope to see some of you there as well.
All right, guys, we had so much good content that we only have a few minutes left for questions, but you will also be getting the recording, and we'll make sure to answer any questions we don't get done through email, but I'm going to sneak a couple in here. The first question, Danielle, I believe is for you. It was in regards to that BU microsite from the beginning of the presentation, and they wanted to know if that was in React.
Good question. View source. Enter the court. Well, actually, we can just, oh, greedy. So I don't think that this is React. Can we look at the assets on the page? Yeah, I'm really being put on the spot here. Not immediately obvious. I'm going to say that. I don't see the build API. So we can follow up and make sure that's included. On the subject of libraries, React really seems to be winning the popularity contest right now, for better or for worse. I personally found React to be enjoyable and JSX for templating. Redux is like kind of like this mind-blowing experience. Like make sure you have a full day to understand, or at least like dive into Redux and begin to understand it. Essentially, Redux is this library for pulling data out of your database into your application at a variety of points. Because when you're building a single page app, like one of the principal challenges is that your application wants access to the data in the database, all of the data, but you don't want to load all of the data over the wire at the very beginning or even at all. So you have to kind of figure out how to like progressively bring the data from the database into your application without having a loading effect and that sort of thing. I think that to me is like one of the key complexities with a decoupled app. But another couple libraries that people use, another Angular, it's been around for a while. And then Vue.js, I've heard some really good things about, and I think that I would explore Vue.js over React in the next application that I build. Although React 2 has React Native, which I think is almost ready for production prime time. React Native will compile your JavaScript to iOS and let you do a native app with it. So lots of open questions, no established best practices there yet.
All right, next question is, how does the WordPress REST API compare to the Drupal REST API?
I have no idea. Andrew?
That's a good question. Can do similar things with them. So all of the concepts we talked about with routes and endpoints and requests and responses and status code, all of those things apply. Obviously, the WordPress specific functions we've talked about in the presentation today don't apply. But I would encourage you to check out our previous webinar that sort of talked about whether you should use WordPress or Drupal for a project and make your CMS decision based on the data and how you're going to be storing things and what types of content you're dealing with. And then after that, you can work with the REST API for either one.
Alrighty, next question is, what is the security related to viewing the API endpoints using WP API?
So the design decision for the API was that data can be considered safe to publicly expose if it's already publicly accessible in some form. So in all of the content endpoints, posts, terms, comments, users, that sort of thing, most of that data is actually already in RSS feeds or already exposed on the front end of the site, that sort of thing. I think that there's been some pushback about so WordPress has user logins, which is like the login username, and then user nice name. And often user login is the same as user nice name. That's what WordPress does by default. And so the REST API makes it much easier to enumerate user logins and try to hack the site or whatever, guess passwords, that sort of thing. But the user nice name is already exposed in the URL for an author on a site in a stock WordPress install. And so a lot of the how do we decide what information is public versus private was based off of the prior art of what information is already public and not public.
All right, I think we're going to sneak one more in there, and that is, what is the recommended way to query by post meta or tax meta?
That sounds like a good pitch for solar power, Andrew.
Actually, I would encourage you to check out, if you're working with JavaScript, the WP API client that we showed earlier as part of Kay Adams' example. It makes it really easy to query against the REST API. and dealing with metadata and taxonomy data and things like that. So that client will really help you when you go to make those requests.
Okay, I'll sneak one more question and then we'll continue to the thank you emails. It says, regarding authentication, it doesn't look like users can register as a WordPress user through the API. Is this true, and are there plans to change that, or are there any good workarounds?
That is correct.
Actually,
Oh,
you can't. Unauthenticated users can't create, unauthenticated requests can't create new users through REST API. I don't think that that will ever be possible. There's lots of web apps on the web that, for instance, GitHub, the GitHub API doesn't permit just, you to create a new user through an API request. You actually have to go through their login pages and that sort of thing. As far as workarounds go, create your own endpoint if you really want that, but you have to be very wary of, obviously security. You don't want users to be able to create admin users, that sort of thing, but also throttling and handling spammers and that sort of thing.
alrighty. That's definitely all we have time for today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you have any additional questions or feedback, please visit our website where you'll find a contact us page and we'll put you in touch with the best member of our team. Have a great week, everyone.
Hey, thanks so much.